The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, wedged between a grocery store circular and a credit card offer that promised 0% interest for 12 months. It was cream-colored, heavy stock paper, the kind that announced its own importance before you even broke the seal. The return address read, Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, in an elegant serif font that somehow managed to look both official and condescending at the same time. Marcus Chen held it up to the morning light streaming through his kitchen window, watching dust motes dance in the air, and felt the first stirrings of something he couldn't quite name. Unease, perhaps, or maybe just the quiet recognition that his peaceful existence was about to be disrupted in ways he couldn't yet imagine. He set his coffee mug down on the weathered oak table his grandfather had built 60 years ago, the same table where 3 generations of Chens had shared meals, argued politics, celebrated victories, and mourned losses. The wood bore the scars of that history. A burn mark from where his mother had set down a too-hot pot when Marcus was 7, a series of small gouges from where he'd done homework with excessive enthusiasm, a water ring that no amount of polish could fully erase. Marcus ran his fingers over these familiar imperfections as he slid his thumb under the envelope's flap, breaking the seal with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet of his kitchen. The letter inside was printed on matching cream paper, single-spaced, with the HOA logo embossed at the top. Marcus had to admit they'd invested in quality stationery, even if he found the whole thing slightly ridiculous. He'd lived in this house his entire life, 38 years of continuity in an increasingly fragmented world, and the HOA had only existed for the last 5 of those. They'd formed when the Riverside Development Company had purchased the surrounding farmland and built Meadowbrook Estates, a sprawling subdivision of identical 3-bedroom homes with 2-car garages and postage stamp lawns that stretched north, south, and west of Marcus's property. His land, all 4 acres of it, sat like an island in the middle of their suburban sea, a geographic anomaly that the developers had been forced to work around. Marcus began to read, and with each sentence, the unease in his stomach solidified into something harder and sharper. The letter opened with pleasantries, thanking him for being a valued member of the community, though he'd never actually joined their association and had told them as much on 3 separate occasions. It referenced previous correspondence, which Marcus had indeed received and promptly ignored, assuming that his non-membership status would eventually sink in. Apparently, it had not. The letter's tone shifted in the second paragraph, adopting what Marcus recognized as the particular brand of passive-aggressive bureaucracies that organizations use when they want to threaten you while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. The HOA, the letter explained, had received numerous complaints from concerned residents regarding Marcus's front and side yards. These complaints, detailed in an attached document that Marcus flipped to with growing disbelief, described his property as an eyesore, a potential health hazard, and a violation of community standards. The specific offense, as the letter eventually got around to stating in bold text for emphasis, was unauthorized agricultural activity in a residentially zoned area. Marcus looked up from the paper and out his window at his yard, trying to see it through the eyes of whoever had filed these complaints. What he saw was the same thing he saw every morning: raised garden beds filled with tomatoes, peppers, squash, and beans, a small herb garden near the kitchen door, a patch of sunflowers his niece had planted during her last visit, and the old apple trees that had stood since his grandfather's time. Agricultural activity. The phrase would have been funny if it weren't so deliberately inflammatory. Marcus grew vegetables the way millions of Americans grew vegetables, in a home garden that provided fresh produce for his table and occasional extras for neighbors and the local food bank. He wasn't operating a commercial farm. He wasn't selling produce. He wasn't running heavy machinery at dawn or storing industrial quantities of fertilizer. He had tomato plants and a compost bin and the kind of small-scale garden that would have been completely unremarkable in any era except, apparently, this one. The letter continued, and the tone shifted from passive-aggressive to openly aggressive. The HOA cited Section 12, Paragraph 7 of their covenants, conditions, and restrictions, which prohibited any form of agricultural, farming, or cultivation activity beyond basic landscaping. The penalty for violation was steep, structured in a way that suggested careful calculation by someone who understood the power of escalating consequences. First offense, a warning. Second offense, a $500 fine. Third offense, a $5,000 fine. Current offense, which the letter categorized as ongoing and continuous despite multiple warnings, $50,000, payable within 30 days, or the HOA would place a lien on his property and begin foreclosure proceedings. $50,000 for tomatoes. The number was so absurd that Marcus actually laughed, a short bark of sound that startled the cat sleeping in a patch of sunlight by the door. But the laughter died quickly when he reached the letter's final paragraph, which informed him that the HOA board would be conducting an official property inspection in 3 days, on Friday at 10 in the morning, and that his cooperation in this matter was not optional. The letter was signed by Sandra Whitmore, HOA president, with a signature that looked like it had been practiced for maximum flourish. Marcus set the letter down and picked up his coffee, which had gone lukewarm while he read. He drank it anyway, barely tasting it, his mind already racing through the implications. The HOA couldn't actually fine him, could they? He'd never signed their covenants. His property predated their development by decades. His house had stood on this land since 1962, when his grandparents had built it with their own hands and the help of neighbors who knew what community actually meant, before the word had been co-opted by developers and weaponized by people like Sandra Whitmore. But the threat of a lien, of foreclosure, that was serious regardless of the legal merits. Even fighting a baseless claim in court would cost money he'd rather not spend, and time he'd rather not waste. He walked to the window and looked out at his garden. Really looked at it, trying to understand what inspired such hostility. The beds were neat, constructed from untreated cedar boards that had weathered to a soft gray. The plants were healthy, staked, and trellised where needed, free of the kind of neglect that might legitimately concern neighbors. The whole setup occupied maybe a 1/4 acre of his 4-acre property, concentrated in the areas that got the best sun. The rest of his land was a mix of old-growth trees, a small pond his grandfather had dug, and open lawn that he mowed regularly. It was, by any objective measure, well-maintained private property that happened to prioritize use over pure aesthetics. But that was the thing, wasn't it? Use. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA didn't value use. They valued uniformity. Every home in their subdivision had the same approved palette of exterior colors, beige, taupe, or gray, with white or black trim. Every lawn had to be maintained at a specific height, between 2 and 3 inches, with no more than 5% weed coverage. Every tree had to be selected from a pre-approved list of ornamental species. The CCRs ran to 47 pages of restrictions on everything from mailbox design to holiday decoration schedules. Marcus had read through them once, with increasing incredulity. When the HOA had first tried to claim he was subject to their rules, it was a document born of a very particular worldview, one that saw freedom as a threat and conformity as the highest virtue. His phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him from his thoughts. A text from his sister, Linda, who lived 2 hours away but maintained an almost supernatural awareness of family drama. The message was brief. "Heard you got a letter from the HOA. Call me." Marcus smiled despite himself. Linda had probably heard from their cousin Tom, who lived in Meadowbrook Estates and served as a reluctant intelligence asset, feeding information about HOA meetings and neighborhood gossip back to Marcus, with the apologetic air of someone who knew he lived among the enemy, but had been trapped there by affordable housing prices and good schools. Marcus called her back, putting the phone on speaker while he refilled his coffee mug. Linda answered on the first ring, her voice already wound up with the particular energy she brought to fights, whether they were hers or someone else's. She wanted to know everything, and Marcus walked her through the letter paragraph by paragraph, reading the relevant sections aloud. Linda's reactions ranged from snorts of disbelief to creative suggestions for what the HOA president could do with her covenants and restrictions, several of which would have been anatomically challenging. But beneath the humor, Marcus could hear genuine concern. Linda understood, as he did, that this wasn't really about tomatoes or property values. This was about power, about a certain type of person who couldn't stand seeing someone operate outside their system of control. The conversation eventually turned to the question that mattered. What was Marcus going to do about it? Linda advocated for immediate legal action, finding a property lawyer who could shut this down before it escalated further. Marcus wasn't opposed to the idea, but something held him back. Some instinct, inherited perhaps from his grandfather, who'd always said that you should understand a situation fully before you act, told him to wait, to watch, to see exactly how far the HOA was willing to push this before he revealed his hand. Because Marcus had an advantage that Sandra Whitmore and her board didn't know about, something he'd discovered 5 years ago when the development company had first approached him about selling his land. His grandfather, it turned out, had been a more shrewd businessman than family legend suggested. When developers had started buying up farmland in the 1980s, eyeing the area for future suburban expansion, Chen Wei had refused to sell. But he'd done something cleverer than simply saying no. He'd purchased additional parcels around his property, working through a family trust that kept his name off the public records, acquiring title to nearly 200 acres of what would eventually become prime development land. When he died, those properties had passed to Marcus's father, and when Marcus's father died, they'd passed to Marcus. The whole arrangement had been quiet, intentional, designed to protect the family property from exactly the kind of pressure that developers inevitably applied. Marcus hadn't thought much about those holdings until Riverside Development had shown up with offers to buy his house. Their first offer had been generous. Their second, when he'd refused the first, had been insulting, clearly designed to pressure him into accepting the earlier number. Marcus had done his due diligence then, hiring a title company to map out exactly what he owned. The answer had been illuminating. The trust his grandfather had established owned not just Marcus's 4 acres, but the land underneath approximately 60% of Meadowbrook Estates. Riverside Development had acquired it all through a 99-year lease, signed in 1987, with terms that heavily favored the landowner. Chen Wei had taken their money, laughed all the way to the bank, and never told anyone in the family about the arrangement except in a letter Marcus's father had found after the old man's funeral. The lease was obscure enough that the developers had probably assumed the original landowner was long dead, the trust dissolved, the whole thing too complicated to matter. They'd built their subdivision, sold their homes, established their HOA, and presumably never looked back at the legal foundation it all rested on. But Marcus had looked. He'd read every word of that lease agreement, studied its provisions, consulted with a property attorney who'd been amazed at how favorable the terms were, and he'd learned something interesting. The lease included a clause allowing the landowner to terminate the agreement with 90 days' notice if the lessee violated any of several conditions, including illegal use of the property, failure to maintain lease payments, or harassment of the landowner. Marcus hadn't told Linda about this, not yet. He'd kept it to himself, a card held close to the chest, because he'd never needed to play it, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. Terminating the lease would be nuclear option, the kind of move that would destroy significant property values and probably get him sued 6 ways from Sunday, regardless of the legal merits. It would hurt people like Tom, good people who'd bought homes in Meadowbrook Estates without any idea that their property rights were built on such shaky ground. Marcus wasn't vindictive. He didn't want to cause that kind of chaos, but the HOA didn't know that, and the more he thought about their letter, their fines, their threats, the more he wondered if maybe it was time they learned exactly who they were dealing with. The rest of Tuesday passed in a blur of routine tasks that Marcus performed on autopilot while his mind churned through scenarios. He taught his 2 afternoon classes at the community college, American history and political science, subjects he'd loved since high school and never tired of exploring with students. Today's topic in American history was property rights in the early republic, which felt almost cosmically appropriate given the morning's mail. Marcus found himself more animated than usual, diving deep into the conflict between Jeffersonian ideals of small landholders and the reality of land speculation and concentrated ownership. Several students who usually checked their phones throughout class actually looked up and engaged, sensing perhaps that today's material had particular resonance for their professor. After class, Marcus stopped by the local library, where his friend Maria worked as head librarian. Maria had lived in the area even longer than the Chens, her family having been among the original Hispanic settlers of the region in the 1800s. She had strong opinions about the HOA, none of them positive, and had been collecting stories from other residents who'd run afoul of the board's arbitrary enforcement of rules. Over coffee in the library's small staff room, Marcus showed her the letter. Maria's reaction was immediate and volcanic, a stream of Spanish invective that Marcus only partially understood but completely appreciated in spirit. She'd heard about Sandra Whitmore's crusade against non-conforming properties, Maria told him. Apparently, his garden was just the latest target. There'd been an elderly couple on the east side of the development who'd installed a small prayer garden with a statue of the Virgin Mary. The HOA had demanded its removal. A young family had painted their front door red, a cheerful splash of color that violated the approved palette. The HOA had levied fines until they repainted it regulation gray. The pattern was clear. The HOA wasn't enforcing rules for the sake of property values or community standards. They were enforcing rules for the sake of enforcement, because having power meant nothing if you didn't use it to make people comply. Sandra Whitmore, Maria said with the certainty of someone who'd watched this personality type rise to petty authority positions for 40 years, was exactly the kind of person who'd been a hall monitor in middle school, a stickler for every minor regulation, someone who found purpose not in building things but in tearing down anything that didn't fit her narrow vision of order. Marcus left the library with a head full of thoughts and a growing sense that whatever he decided to do, it needed to be decisive. Half measures wouldn't work with people like this. Trying to reason with them, to explain that his garden was harmless and actually beneficial, would be wasted breath. They didn't care about reason, they cared about control, and the only language they'd understand was power applied with enough force to make them reconsider their position. The question was how much force was appropriate and how much collateral damage Marcus was willing to accept. Wednesday morning brought another letter, this one delivered by certified mail, which required Marcus's signature and felt like an escalation all on its own. The content was essentially a repeat of Tuesday's letter, but with additional legal language about property liens and the HOA's right to enforce covenants against all properties within their jurisdiction. Marcus noted the phrase, all properties, with particular interest. The HOA was claiming jurisdiction over his land, asserting that simply being surrounded by their development made him subject to their rules. It was legally dubious at best, completely baseless at worst, and it suggested that whoever was advising the board on legal matters either didn't know what they were talking about or didn't care. Marcus spent Wednesday evening in his home office, surrounded by boxes of old family documents that he'd been meaning to organize for years. He found what he was looking for in the third box he opened, the original lease agreement between the Chen Family Trust and Riverside Development, along with subsequent amendments and the annual accounting of lease payments. Everything was in order, meticulously maintained by the trust's management company. The payments came like clockwork, deposited into an account that Marcus barely paid attention to because the money had always just been there, a background detail of his financial life that he'd never needed to think about much. He read through the lease termination clause again, paying close attention to the language. Harassment of the landowner. That was the relevant provision. The lease defined harassment as any attempt to interfere with the landowner's quiet enjoyment of their property through intimidation, legal threats, or persistent unwanted contact. Marcus could argue that the HOA's letters met that definition, but he wanted to be sure. He wanted documentation, a clear pattern of behavior that would stand up if this ever went to court. So he decided to let Friday's inspection happen. He'd be polite, cooperative even, and he'd document everything. He'd give the HOA enough rope to hang themselves, and then he'd decide whether to pull the lever. Thursday was quiet, a day of preparation. Marcus mowed his lawn, not because he cared what the HOA thought, but because he took pride in his property. He weeded the garden beds, harvested some early tomatoes that had ripened beautifully, and generally made sure that anyone conducting an inspection would find nothing but well-maintained grounds. He charged his phone fully, making sure he'd be able to record video of the entire inspection. He reviewed his property survey, confirming his boundary lines so there'd be no confusion about what was and wasn't his land. And he called his attorney, a woman named Rebecca Torres, who'd helped him understand the lease situation 5 years ago, and who listened to his current problem with the kind of careful attention that good lawyers brought to potentially explosive situations. Rebecca's advice was measured. Document everything. Yes. Be polite. Absolutely. But don't volunteer anything, don't sign anything, and don't make any commitments about changing his property. If the HOA inspectors claimed authority they didn't have, which Rebecca suspected they would, Marcus should simply note their claims without agreeing or disagreeing. And when the inspection was over, he should send Rebecca all the documentation and they'd decide on next steps. She also mentioned, almost casually, that she'd reviewed the lease termination clause recently and found it remarkably solid. If Marcus wanted to go that route, he'd have legal grounds. But it would be, she emphasized, a nuclear option with far-reaching consequences that needed to be considered carefully. Marcus went to bed Thursday night with his mind made up about nothing, except the fact that he'd face Friday's inspection with open eyes and a clear head. Whatever happened next would depend on the HOA's behavior, on whether they proved themselves reasonable people enforcing unreasonable rules or unreasonable people drunk on tiny amounts of power. He suspected the latter. But he wanted to be fair. He wanted to give them every chance to back down, to recognize that they were picking a fight they didn't understand. And if they didn't take those chances, well, Then Marcus would show them exactly what kind of opponent they'd chosen. Friday morning arrived with perfect weather, sunny and mild. The kind of day that made Marcus grateful he lived where he lived and did what he did. He'd taken the day off from teaching, cleared his schedule, and positioned himself to watch from his kitchen window as the inspection team arrived. They came in 3 vehicles, which seemed excessive for looking at tomato plants, but fit the HOA's apparent love of bureaucratic theater. Sandra Whitmore emerged from the first car, a silver Lexus that gleamed in the morning sun. She was younger than Marcus had pictured, maybe mid-40s, dressed in business casual attire that seemed calculated to project authority. 2 board members climbed out of the second vehicle, and from the third came a man in khakis and a polo shirt, carrying a clipboard and a camera with a lens that looked better suited to wildlife photography than property inspection. Marcus watched them confer in his driveway, pointing at his house and garden, their body language speaking to a coordination that suggested they'd done this before. Sandra Whitmore appeared to be giving instructions, and the others nodded with the kind of deference that subordinates showed to bosses who enjoyed their authority a bit too much. After a few minutes of this, they began walking toward his front door, and Marcus moved to meet them, stepping outside before they could knock. He wanted this interaction to happen in his yard, on his terms, not inside his house where they might claim some kind of invitation or access. Sandra Whitmore's smile was bright and professional and completely failed to reach her eyes. She introduced herself, though Marcus already knew who she was, and then introduced the board members, Richard Klein and Patricia Moss, and the inspector, whose name was apparently Kevin something. Marcus shook hands with each of them, noting that Sandra's grip was firm enough to be challenging, a power play that he met with equal pressure before releasing. The pleasantries complete, Sandra launched into what sounded like a prepared speech about the HOA's commitment to maintaining property values and community standards. Marcus listened politely, his phone already recording in his shirt pocket, positioned to capture both audio and whatever video it could manage. Richard Klein pulled out a folder and began reading from what Marcus recognized as the complaint letters. There were 7 of them, from 7 different households, all describing Marcus's property in terms that ranged from exaggerated to outright false. One complained about noise from farm equipment, though Marcus owned nothing louder than a lawnmower. Another mentioned foul odors from composting, though his compost bin was a sealed tumbler system specifically designed to prevent smell. A third claimed that his garden attracted pests and vermin, as if tomato plants were somehow more appealing to animals than the bird feeders that half the neighborhood maintained. The complaints were coordinated, Marcus realized, probably solicited by the board specifically to build a case for enforcement action. When Richard finished reading, Sandra asked for permission to inspect the property. Marcus agreed, gesturing to his yard, but specified that they were welcome to look at anything visible from his driveway or the public street. They were not welcome to enter his backyard or approach his house beyond the front walkway. Sandra's smile tightened, but she nodded. Kevin the inspector immediately went to work, photographing Marcus's garden from every conceivable angle, zooming in on individual plants as if they were evidence of serious crimes. Patricia Moss took notes on her tablet, recording observations that Marcus couldn't quite hear, but that involved a lot of head shaking and frowning. The inspection took nearly an hour, which was absurd for examining a quarter acre of vegetables, but Marcus let them take their time. He answered their questions when they asked, explaining what he was growing, how long he'd had the garden, what he did with the produce. He was careful to emphasize that everything was for personal use, that he'd never sold so much as a single tomato, that this was a home garden of the type that millions of Americans maintained without incident. Sandra listened to all of this with an expression of polite skepticism, as if Marcus was trying to convince her that water wasn't wet or the sky wasn't blue. When they finally finished, Sandra pulled out a document from her folder and handed it to Marcus. It was a formal notice of violation, typed and printed on official letterhead, detailing the HOA's findings and restating the $50,000 fine. The notice gave Marcus 30 days to comply by removing all garden beds, ceasing all agricultural activity, and restoring his property to approved landscaping standards. Failure to comply would result in the lien and foreclosure proceedings they'd mentioned in the letters. Sandra explained all of this in a tone that suggested she was being remarkably patient with a difficult child, and then she asked Marcus to sign the notice to acknowledge receipt. Marcus looked at the document, then at Sandra, then at the other board members who were watching this exchange with expressions ranging from awkwardness to anticipation. This was the moment, he realized, where he needed to make a choice. He could sign, could play along, could continue documenting their overreach while preparing a legal response. Or he could draw a line here, could make clear that their authority was not what they believed it to be, could begin the process of showing them exactly how wrong they were about their position. The lawyer in his head, the voice that sounded like Rebecca Torres, told him to sign and wait. But the part of him that was Chen Wei's grandson, that had inherited stubbornness and principle in equal measure, told him to stand his ground. Marcus handed the document back unsigned. He told Sandra, politely but firmly, that he would not be acknowledging receipt of a notice from an organization he didn't belong to, regarding violations of rules he'd never agreed to follow, on property that he owned free and clear. He informed her that he'd be documenting their inspection and all future communications, and that she should consider this his formal notice, that any further harassment would result in legal action. Sandra's smile vanished entirely. She told Marcus, her voice losing its professional veneer and gaining an edge of genuine anger, that his refusal to cooperate would be noted and would factor into the board's enforcement decisions. Marcus responded that she should do what she felt she needed to do, and he would do the same. The inspection team left in their 3 vehicles, and Marcus stood in his driveway watching them go, feeling the weight of what he'd just set in motion. This was no longer a situation that would resolve quietly. The HOA would escalate, he was certain of it, because people like Sandra Whitmore didn't back down when challenged. They doubled down. They raised the stakes. They turned disagreements into wars because winning mattered more than being right. And that was fine with Marcus, because he'd been raised by people who understood that some fights were worth having, that standing up to bullies was a moral obligation even when it was inconvenient, and that owning your principles meant being willing to defend them when the cost got steep. He went inside and sent the inspection video to Rebecca with a detailed email describing everything that had happened. Then he pulled out the lease documents again and began making notes, mapping out exactly what terminating the agreement would mean and who it would affect. He wasn't committed to that path yet, but he wanted to be prepared if the HOA forced his hand. Because if they wanted to play games about property rights and legal authority, Marcus was ready to show them what actual property rights looked like and how quickly their suburban kingdom could crumble when the ground underneath it belonged to someone else. The weekend passed quietly, but Marcus knew it was the calm before a storm that neither he nor the HOA could fully control once it began. And somewhere in that certainty, he found himself almost looking forward to what came next. Monday morning arrived with the kind of oppressive humidity that made the air feel thick enough to swim through, the sort of weather that shortened tempers and made small annoyances feel like major grievances. Marcus was in his garden by 7, taking advantage of the early coolness before the sun turned his yard into a greenhouse, when he noticed the first sign that the HOA had decided to escalate their campaign. A bright orange notice had been posted on a wooden stake driven into his front lawn, right at the property line where it would be visible to anyone driving past. The notice was laminated, professional-looking, and declared in bold letters that the property was under investigation for code violations and that a lien was pending. It was pure theater, designed to embarrass and intimidate, and it told Marcus everything he needed to know about Sandra Whitmore's approach to conflict resolution. He pulled the stake out of the ground and examined it more closely. The notice cited county code enforcement, which was interesting because Marcus knew for a fact that his property was in full compliance with actual county codes. He'd checked extensively when the HOA first started making noise, wanting to ensure he had solid legal footing. The HOA was apparently hoping that neighbors and passersby wouldn't know the difference between their made-up violations and real legal issues, counting on the general assumption that official-looking documents must be legitimate. It was a calculated move to damage his reputation and property value, the kind of maneuver that people who thought 3 moves ahead would recognize as a serious mistake. Marcus photographed the notice from multiple angles, documented exactly where it had been placed, and then brought it inside to add to his growing file of HOA overreach. He sent the photos to Rebecca with a brief message, noting that the stakes had been raised, quite literally. Her response came back within minutes, consisting of 3 words followed by an exclamation point: "Document everything meticulously." Marcus appreciated lawyers who understood the value of brevity when the situation was clear. The second incident occurred on Tuesday, when Marcus returned home from teaching to find that someone had filed a complaint with the actual county code enforcement office. He knew this because an inspector showed up Wednesday afternoon, a tired-looking man in his 50s who apologized before he even explained why he was there. The inspector, whose name was Joe Mendoza, made it clear that he thought the complaint was bogus, but that he was obligated to follow up on all reports. Marcus gave him a tour of the property, answering questions about his garden, his compost system, his water usage, everything the inspector needed to see to complete his report. Joe took notes, snapped a few photos, and shook his head with the resignation of someone who dealt with HOA nonsense on a regular basis. Before he left, Joe offered Marcus some unofficial advice. The HOA, he said, had been increasingly aggressive about filing complaints against properties they wanted to target, weaponizing the code enforcement system to harass people who didn't fall in line with their aesthetic preferences. Most of these complaints were dismissed, but they created a paper trail that the HOA could point to when claiming that a property was problematic. Joe had seen this pattern before, and it usually ended one of two ways. Either the property owner gave up and complied to make the harassment stop, or things escalated into expensive legal battles that benefited nobody except the attorneys. He suggested that Marcus might want to consider which path he was willing to take, because Sandra Whitmore had a reputation for being relentless once she decided someone was her enemy. Marcus thanked Joe for the heads up and assured him that he was well aware of what he was getting into. After the inspector left, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee and the lease document spread out in front of him, really thinking through the implications of what he was considering. Terminating the lease would affect roughly 240 homes in Meadowbrook Estates, the 60% that sat on land owned by his family trust. Those homeowners would suddenly find themselves in an incredibly precarious position, living in houses built on land they didn't own and couldn't easily acquire rights to. Property values would tank overnight. Mortgages would become complicated. Some people might lose their homes entirely if they couldn't secure new agreements or afford to relocate. It would be a catastrophe for a lot of innocent people who'd simply bought homes without realizing the legal complexity underneath. But the alternative was to let the HOA continue their harassment campaign, to reward their bullying by backing down, to establish a precedent that people like Sandra Whitmore could use threats and intimidation to get their way. Marcus had spent his entire adult life teaching his students about the importance of standing up for principles, even when it was costly, about how power unchecked inevitably led to abuse, about how bullies only understood one language. If he didn't practice what he preached, what did that say about his own integrity? And more practically, if he gave in now, what would stop the HOA from coming after him again in 6 months with some new manufactured violation? Some new set of demands that would erode his property rights inch by inch, until he was left with nothing but a house on land he couldn't actually use as he saw fit? Thursday brought another escalation, this time in the form of a letter from a law firm representing the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. The letter was longer than the previous correspondence, full of legal jargon and citations to case law that Marcus suspected had been chosen more for intimidation factor than relevance. The firm, Blackwood & Associates, specialized in HOA law and had apparently been retained to pursue the matter aggressively. They reiterated the $50,000 fine, added legal fees and administrative costs that brought the total demanded amount to nearly $65,000, and gave Marcus 14 days to either pay in full or enter into a compliance agreement that would require him to remove his garden and submit to regular HOA inspections for the next 5 years. The letter also contained a new and particularly offensive element, a proposed settlement agreement that would require Marcus to grant the HOA an easement across his property, allowing them to access what they called a potential future greenway connector. Marcus read this section 3 times, making sure he understood what they were asking for. The HOA wanted a permanent right to use a strip of his land, essentially creating a path that would let them connect different parts of their development across his property. It was a land grab dressed up as a compromise, and it confirmed that this had never been about garden aesthetics or property values. This was about control, about forcing Marcus to submit to their authority, and about acquiring rights to his land that they could leverage in the future. Marcus called Rebecca, and for the first time since this situation started, he heard genuine anger in his attorney's voice. The easement demand was outrageous, she said, completely unrelated to the original complaint and clearly designed to extract value from Marcus under duress. It also potentially provided additional grounds for lease termination because the HOA was now attempting to acquire property rights through intimidation, which could be argued as harassment under the lease terms. Rebecca suggested that they schedule a formal meeting to discuss options, but she also said something that gave Marcus pause. She asked him directly if he was prepared to terminate the lease, if he understood what that would mean not just legally, but morally, if he could live with being the person who upended hundreds of families' lives, even if they weren't personally responsible for the HOA's actions. It was the right question. the one Marcus had been wrestling with in his own mind, but hadn't yet articulated so clearly. Could he do this? Should he do this? The HOA board might consist of petty tyrants and power-hungry bureaucrats, but the people living in those houses were teachers and nurses and accountants and retail workers and all the other ordinary people who made up a community. They'd bought their homes in good faith, probably never even looked at the underlying property documents, and would be blindsided by the discovery that their land wasn't as secure as they'd believed. It wasn't fair to them. But was it fair to Marcus to let their ignorance protect the HOA from consequences? Was it his responsibility to absorb harassment and legal threats because other people had failed to do their due diligence? The answer, Marcus realized, was that fairness didn't really enter into it. The situation was unfair from every angle. The HOA was being unfair to Marcus. Terminating the lease would be unfair to the homeowners. The developers had been unfair to everyone by building a community on such a shaky legal foundation and then failing to disclose that fact to buyers. There was no path forward that didn't hurt someone, and trying to find one was just a way of avoiding the hard choice he needed to make. So Marcus stopped thinking about fairness and started thinking about effectiveness. What would actually stop the HOA? What would protect his property rights? What would send a message that couldn't be ignored or explained away? Friday brought his answer in the form of another HOA action, one so egregiously over the line that it clarified Marcus's thinking completely. He woke to find that someone had entered his property overnight and destroyed his garden. Not damaged it, not vandalized it in the typical sense of teenagers looking for trouble, but systematically destroyed it with clear intent. Every plant had been uprooted and left to die in the morning sun. The raised beds had been partially dismantled, their boards scattered across the lawn. His compost bin had been tipped over, its contents spread in a deliberate pattern that spelled out the letters HOA in decomposing vegetables and yard waste. It was vandalism elevated to performance art, and it was absolutely, unquestionably criminal. Marcus stood in his yard, his phone in his hand, methodically photographing everything before he touched anything. The morning light was perfect for documentation, clear and bright, showing every detail of the destruction in sharp relief. He called the police first, reported the vandalism and trespassing, and was told a patrol officer would be there within the hour. Then he called Rebecca and told her what had happened. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and when Rebecca spoke again, her voice had the flat quality of someone who'd moved beyond anger into cold calculation. She told Marcus to document everything, to get the police report, and to do absolutely nothing else until they met in person. She'd be at his house by noon. The police officer who responded was young, probably not long out of the academy, and he took the report with the kind of thoroughness that suggested either diligence or inexperience. Marcus walked him through the scene, pointed out where someone would have had to enter the property to do this kind of damage, showed him the security camera footage from his front porch that had captured a vehicle driving away around 2 a.m. The camera angle wasn't great, but it clearly showed a dark SUV with a Meadowbrook Estates parking sticker on the rear bumper. The officer made notes, took his own photos, and told Marcus that the report would be forwarded to detectives for follow-up. He also mentioned, unprompted, that he'd seen an uptick in HOA-related complaints lately, and that things in this neighborhood seemed to be getting tenser by the week. Rebecca arrived at noon exactly, accompanied by another attorney from her firm, a man named David Park, who specialized in property litigation. They sat at Marcus's kitchen table, the same table where he'd first read the HOA's letter 2 weeks ago, and they laid out the situation with the kind of clinical precision that lawyers brought to complicated cases. The vandalism changed everything, David explained, because it demonstrated that the HOA was willing to engage in criminal activity to force compliance. That suggested desperation, which in turn suggested that they knew their legal position was weak. No organization that was confident in their right to levy fines and enforce covenants would resort to destroying property in the middle of the night. The question now was how to respond. Rebecca and David presented 3 options. First, Marcus could pursue criminal charges against whoever was responsible for the vandalism, fight the HOA's demands in civil court, and essentially commit to years of legal battles that would be expensive and emotionally draining regardless of who eventually won. Second, he could accept some version of the HOA's settlement offer, comply with their demands, and try to move on with his life. It would mean giving up his garden and accepting HOA authority over his property, but it would end the immediate conflict. Third, he could terminate the lease, which would eliminate the HOA's ability to operate by removing the legal foundation of roughly 60% of their community. This option would cause massive collateral damage, but would definitively end the HOA's ability to harass Marcus. David was straightforward about the implications of the third option. Terminating the lease would trigger chaos. The development company, Riverside Development, would likely sue to prevent termination or at least delay it. The HOA would certainly sue, claiming all sorts of damages. Individual homeowners might sue, arguing that Marcus had a responsibility to maintain the lease. It would be a legal nightmare that could take years to resolve, and Marcus would be the villain in the eyes of hundreds of families who would blame him for destroying their property values and their sense of security. But, and David emphasized this point, Marcus would probably win. The lease termination clause was solid, the harassment was well documented, and the vandalism provided clear evidence that the conditions for termination had been met. Rebecca added her own perspective, which was more personal than legal. She'd been practicing property law for 25 years, she told Marcus, and she'd seen a lot of HOA disputes. Most of them ended in compromise, because neither side wanted to bear the cost of escalation. But every once in a while, she encountered a case where someone needed to make a stand, where the principle mattered more than the practical outcome, where backing down would cause more long-term damage than fighting would. She thought this might be one of those cases, but she wanted Marcus to be clear-eyed about what he'd be taking on. This wouldn't be easy or clean or quick. It would consume his life for months, possibly years. It would make him enemies. It would be expensive, even if he won. Was he prepared for that? Marcus looked out his kitchen window at his destroyed garden, at the deliberate vandalism that someone had committed to intimidate him into submission, and he felt something crystallize inside him. He'd spent 2 weeks trying to find a reasonable path through this situation, trying to balance his rights against the potential harm to others, trying to be the responsible person who didn't make waves. And where had that gotten him? His property had been criminally vandalized. The HOA was demanding money he didn't owe and property rights they had no claim to. The legal system was being weaponized against him by people who understood that process was punishment, that even winning a court case would cost him time and money and peace of mind. Somewhere in trying to be reasonable, Marcus had forgotten that reasonable only worked when both sides were operating in good faith. He told Rebecca and David to prepare the lease termination notice. He wanted it done properly, with every procedural requirement met, every clause satisfied, every legal argument anticipated and addressed. He wasn't doing this to hurt innocent homeowners, Marcus explained, but he wasn't going to protect people who'd passively benefited from the HOA's authority while it was being used to destroy his property and his rights. If those homeowners wanted to keep their homes, they could take it up with Riverside Development and the HOA board, the entities that had created this situation through greed and arrogance. Marcus was done being the absorber of other people's bad decisions. Rebecca nodded, unsurprised by his choice, but clearly pleased that he'd made it with full understanding of the consequences. She pulled out a laptop and began drafting the notice right there at his table, asking Marcus questions about specific incidents and dates, building a comprehensive record of the harassment that justified termination. David made calls to title companies and surveyors, beginning the process of establishing exactly which properties sat on Chen family trust land and which didn't. It was technical work, the kind of detailed legal preparation that most people never saw, but that made the difference between winning and losing when cases went to court. The notice took 3 hours to draft and another hour to review. When they were finished, Rebecca had produced a document that was simultaneously a legal notice, a historical record, and a declaratory statement about property rights that would probably be cited in real estate law classes for years to come. The notice informed Riverside Development that the Chen Family Trust was exercising its right to terminate the 99-year lease executed in 1987, effective 90 days from receipt of the notice. It detailed the harassment that had occurred, including the vandalism, the false code enforcement complaints, the attempted easement grab, and the pattern of intimidation documented over the previous 2 weeks. It cited the specific clause in the lease that allowed for termination and explained why the conditions had been met. And it made clear that the termination was immediate and non-negotiable, subject only to the 90-day notice period required by contract. Rebecca planned to deliver the notice by certified mail, by hand through a process server, and by email to every address they had for Riverside Development's corporate offices. She wanted there to be no possible claim that the company hadn't been properly notified. David would simultaneously file a lawsuit seeking a declaratory judgment that the termination was valid, which would force any challenge into court on Marcus's terms, rather than letting the development company control the timing and venue of litigation. It was aggressive, lawyering, the kind that anticipated every counter-move and prepared responses in advance. After the attorneys left, Marcus sat alone in his kitchen and thought about what he'd just set in motion. In 90 days, assuming the termination held up, roughly 240 families would discover that they didn't have the property rights they thought they had. Their homes would still exist, but the land underneath would belong to the Chen family trust, and Marcus would have the right to demand new lease terms, or even demand that the homes be removed. It was an extreme position, and Marcus had no intention of actually evicting families from their homes. But the HOA didn't know that. Sandra Whitmore and her board were about to learn that their suburban kingdom was built on sand, and that the quiet professor they'd tried to bully wasn't nearly as powerless as they'd assumed. The weekend was quiet in a way that felt ominous, like the stillness before a major storm. Marcus rebuilt what he could of his garden, salvaging plants that might recover and clearing away the ones that were too damaged to save. It was meditative work, hands in soil, mind focused on concrete tasks rather than abstract legal battles. His neighbors on the actual boundary of his property, a retired couple named the Johnsons, who'd lived there since before Meadowbrook Estates existed, came over to offer condolences and help. They'd seen the vandalism when they woke Friday morning and had actually called the police themselves before Marcus got to it. Mrs. Johnson brought fresh coffee and homemade cookies. Mr. Johnson brought spare lumber for the raised beds and the kind of quiet solidarity that came from decades of watching property disputes play out in small communities. The Johnsons knew about the lease, Marcus discovered. Not the specifics, but the general outline. Mr. Johnson had worked for the county planning department before he retired, and he'd been involved in reviewing the permits when Meadowbrook Estates was first proposed. He remembered Chen Wei coming into the planning office, remembered the old man's shrewd questions about lease terms and development rights, remembered thinking at the time that the developers were getting themselves into an arrangement they didn't fully understand. He'd kept quiet about it over the years, figuring it was none of his business and that it would probably never matter. But now that it did matter, he wanted Marcus to know that whatever he decided to do, the Johnsons would support him. They'd seen how the HOA operated, and they had no sympathy for people who thought conformity was more important than community. Monday morning, Marcus went to work expecting normalcy, but found instead that news of the impending lease termination had already leaked. He didn't know how, whether someone at the title company had talked, or whether Riverside Development had gotten ahead of the story. But by the time he arrived at the college, 3 local news reporters were waiting in the parking lot. They wanted statements, wanted to know if he was really planning to evict 200 families, wanted to paint him as either a crusading property rights advocate or a vindictive neighbor, depending on their editorial slant. Marcus declined to comment, referred them to his attorney, and hurried into the building, feeling like he'd suddenly become a public figure without ever seeking that status. His department chair pulled him aside between classes, concerned about the media attention and how it might affect the college's reputation. Marcus explained the situation as briefly as he could, emphasizing that he hadn't sought this conflict and that he was defending his own property rights against an aggressive HOA. The chair listened, nodded, and said that the administration would support Marcus, but that he should probably expect more media attention as the story developed. Academic freedom protected his right to engage in legal disputes, but controversy tended to make everyone nervous, regardless of the merits. It was a gentle warning that Marcus interpreted correctly: win quickly or prepare for institutional pressure to settle. The notice was delivered to Riverside Development on Tuesday morning, confirmed by the process server at 10:45. Rebecca called Marcus to inform him, and she sounded satisfied in the way lawyers did when they'd executed a plan exactly as intended. Now, she said, they waited. The company had 90 days to respond, and they'd likely spend at least part of that time trying to figure out if the termination was legally enforceable. Rebecca expected them to reach out within a week, probably with settlement offers, possibly with threats. The key was not to engage directly, to let all communication flow through the attorneys, and to stick to the documented facts about harassment and vandalism. Wednesday brought the HOA's response, which was predictably aggressive and surprisingly stupid. Sandra Whitmore sent out an email to the entire Meadowbrook Estates community, forwarded to Marcus by his cousin Tom, that characterized Marcus as a greedy landlord trying to extort money from hard-working families. The email claimed that Marcus had fabricated the harassment allegations, that the garden was indeed a code violation, and that the HOA had offered reasonable compromises, which Marcus had rejected because he wanted to drive up property values on his own land. It was defamatory, probably actionable, and deeply foolish, because it provided written evidence that the HOA president was willing to lie publicly about the situation. Marcus forwarded the email to Rebecca without comment. Her response was succinct: "They're panicking. Good." David followed up with a longer message, explaining that defamation required proving actual malice and damages, which might be hard to establish, but that the email could be used to demonstrate the HOA's bad faith and their continued campaign of harassment. Every stupid move they made strengthened Marcus's case, and Sandra Whitmore seemed determined to make as many stupid moves as possible. Thursday brought something Marcus hadn't expected: support from other HOA critics within Meadowbrook Estates. A woman named Jennifer Acosta reached out through Facebook, explaining that she'd been fined repeatedly for having a vegetable garden in her backyard, even though it wasn't visible from the street and didn't violate any county codes. The HOA had justified the fines using the same agricultural activity restriction they'd cited against Marcus. Jennifer had considered fighting it, but had ultimately backed down because she couldn't afford the legal costs. Now that Marcus was taking on the HOA directly, she wanted to help however she could, possibly by providing documentation of the HOA's pattern of harassment against multiple property owners. Marcus connected Jennifer with Rebecca, and within 2 days, his attorney had collected similar stories from 6 other residents who'd been targeted by the HOA for various minor deviations from the community standards. There was a pattern emerging, and it was damning. The HOA had systematically gone after anyone who showed even mild independence, using the threat of fines and liens to enforce compliance. They'd been particularly aggressive toward people they perceived as unable to afford legal fights: young families with tight budgets, elderly residents on fixed incomes, single parents juggling multiple jobs. Marcus's case was unusual only because he had the resources and the legal leverage to fight back effectively. Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the lease termination notice was delivered, Riverside Development's attorneys reached out to schedule a meeting. They wanted to discuss a resolution, wanted to understand what it would take for Marcus to withdraw the termination notice, wanted to explore options that would protect both Marcus's rights and the company's investment in the development. Rebecca interpreted this as a positive sign, evidence that the company's legal team had reviewed the lease and realized they had a serious problem. She scheduled the meeting for the following Wednesday, giving everyone time to prepare and giving Marcus time to think about what he actually wanted from a resolution. That evening, Marcus sat on his back porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, and he thought about what victory would actually look like. He didn't want to evict families. He didn't want to destroy property values. He didn't particularly want to be remembered as the guy who blew up an HOA, even if they richly deserved it. What he wanted was to be left alone, to live on his property as he saw fit, to grow tomatoes and teach classes and exist peacefully without constant threats and harassment. But he also wanted to establish a precedent that bullying wouldn't work, that organizations couldn't weaponize bureaucracy to crush individual rights, that people who abused power would face consequences. The challenge was finding a resolution that accomplished both goals. Marcus needed to win decisively enough that the HOA would never come after him again, but he needed to do it in a way that didn't destroy innocent people's lives. It was a narrow path, and navigating it would require negotiation skills he wasn't sure he possessed. But he had lawyers who did possess those skills, and he had leverage that Riverside Development couldn't simply ignore. The meeting on Wednesday would tell him a lot about whether a negotiated settlement was possible, or whether this situation was headed for years of litigation. The weekend brought unexpected visitors, in the form of a small delegation from Meadowbrook Estates, led by Marcus's cousin Tom, and including Jennifer Acosta and 2 other residents, who'd been quietly organizing against the HOA's excesses. They came to Marcus's house Saturday afternoon, apologetic about bothering him but insistent that they needed to talk. Over coffee in his living room, they explained that news of the lease termination had created 2 distinct factions within the community. The first faction, led by Sandra Whitmore and her closest allies, was circling the wagons and preparing for legal battle. They were raising money for litigation, soliciting support from residents by painting Marcus as the villain, and generally trying to present a united front against the existential threat to their community. But the second faction, which Tom and Jennifer represented, had a very different perspective. They saw the lease termination as an opportunity to get rid of a dysfunctional HOA board and establish a more reasonable community governance structure. If the current lease was terminated and new agreements needed to be negotiated, that would give residents leverage to demand changes to the restrictive covenants and to install board members who weren't power-hungry petty tyrants. They wanted to know if Marcus would be willing to negotiate individual leases with homeowners that included reasonable restrictions but eliminated the most oppressive elements of the current HOA regime. Essentially, they were asking Marcus to help them destroy the HOA as it currently existed and rebuild something better. It was an interesting proposal, and it got Marcus thinking about possibilities he hadn't fully considered. If he could negotiate directly with individual homeowners, he could create a situation where those families had secure long-term rights to their land while simultaneously eliminating the HOA's authority over his property. The details would be complicated, but the basic framework made sense. He told Tom and Jennifer that he'd discuss it with his attorneys, that he couldn't make any commitments without understanding the legal implications, but that he was interested in exploring options that would protect ordinary residents while removing the people who'd been abusing their authority. After the delegation left, Marcus called Rebecca even though it was Saturday evening. She answered on the third ring, not sounding particularly surprised to hear from him. Marcus laid out the proposal Tom and Jennifer had described, and he could hear Rebecca's brain working through the implications even over the phone. It was complicated, she said, but potentially workable. If Marcus was willing to negotiate individual leases with homeowners, and if those leases included provisions that eliminated the HOA's authority or at least dramatically curtailed it, that could be a path to resolution that didn't require years of litigation. The challenge would be negotiating with 240 households individually, but if most of them were represented by a common organization, maybe that could be streamlined. Rebecca said she'd think about the framework and come prepared to discuss it at Wednesday's meeting with Riverside Development. If the company was willing to cooperate with a reorganization of the community governance structure, that might actually be in their best interest too. A functional community without an oppressive HOA would maintain property values better than the alternative outcomes, which included either endless litigation or Marcus actually following through on lease termination and throwing everything into chaos. It was leverage, and leverage was exactly what they needed to force a resolution that protected everyone except the people who actually deserved to be harmed. Sunday, Marcus attended services at the small church his grandfather had helped build, the same church where Chen Wei had been remembered in a memorial service that drew 200 people, despite his reputation for being difficult and stubborn. The pastor, Father Miguel, knew Marcus well and had heard about the HOA conflict through the community grapevine. After services, he pulled Marcus aside to offer support and to tell him something Marcus needed to hear. Standing up to bullies was important, Father Miguel said, but so was showing mercy to people caught in situations not of their making. The true measure of victory wouldn't be in defeating the HOA, but in how Marcus treated people when he had power over them. It was a gentle reminder that having leverage was one thing and using it wisely was another, and Marcus appreciated the perspective even as he felt the weight of the responsibility it implied. Monday brought developments that accelerated everything. Riverside Development, faced with the prospect of losing control of 60% of its most profitable development, announced that it was replacing the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board with interim managers appointed by the company. Sandra Whitmore and her allies were out, effective immediately, and the company was taking direct control of community governance while the lease situation was resolved. It was a dramatic move, clearly calculated to show Marcus that the company was taking the situation seriously and was willing to remove the people who'd created the problem. It was also probably illegal under the HOA's own governing documents, but nobody seemed particularly interested in defending Sandra Whitmore's right to remain in power. The news exploded across local media and social media simultaneously. Residents of Meadowbrook Estates were divided between relief that the oppressive board was gone and panic about what the lease termination meant for their own property rights. Marcus's phone buzzed constantly with messages from reporters, from neighbors, from random people who'd gotten his number somehow and wanted to share their opinions about the situation. He turned off notifications after the 50th message and tried to focus on preparing for Wednesday's meeting, which had suddenly become even more important than it had been before. Tuesday evening, Marcus sat down with his sister Linda for the first time since this whole situation began. She'd been following the news coverage, talking to cousin Tom regularly, and generally staying informed while giving Marcus space to handle things his way. Now, With the meeting less than 24 hours away, she wanted to make sure Marcus was thinking clearly about what he was negotiating for. Linda had always been the practical one, the sibling who thought 3 moves ahead and worried about unintended consequences. She wanted to know if Marcus had really considered what long-term management of individual leases would mean, whether he wanted to spend the next few decades as a landlord to 240 households, whether he understood that this would fundamentally change his relationship with everyone in the community. Marcus admitted that he hadn't fully thought through those implications. He'd been so focused on stopping the HOA's harassment and on protecting his own rights that he hadn't really processed what winning would actually entail on a day-to-day basis. Linda, in her typical direct fashion, told him that he needed to figure that out before the meeting tomorrow, because negotiating a deal that left him technically victorious but practically miserable would be a mistake. She suggested that maybe the right answer was to negotiate a deal that protected Marcus's property absolutely, but that transferred the land under the other homes to those homeowners directly, getting the Chen family trust out of the landlord business entirely, while ensuring that no future HOA could ever claim authority over Marcus's land. It was good advice, and it clarified something Marcus had been circling around without quite articulating. He didn't want power over other people. He wanted freedom for himself. Those weren't the same thing, and conflating them would lead to decisions he'd regret. What Marcus needed was a resolution that gave him complete authority over his own 4 acres, while releasing the rest of the land from the trust's ownership in a way that protected individual homeowners. That would eliminate any future possibility of HOA overreach, while also eliminating Marcus's ongoing involvement in other people's property rights. It was cleaner, simpler, and more aligned with what he actually wanted from life. Wednesday morning arrived with the clarity that came from finally knowing what he was negotiating for. Marcus met Rebecca and David at their office an hour before the scheduled meeting with Riverside Development's representatives. He laid out his thinking, explaining that he wanted a resolution that protected his property absolutely, but that transferred ownership of the other parcels to individual homeowners, eliminating the trust's role as landlord. Rebecca and David looked at each other, one of those wordless attorney communications that spoke volumes. And then Rebecca smiled. That, she said, was actually a much more reasonable position than the one they'd been prepared to negotiate from, and it gave them room to offer Riverside Development a face-saving resolution that would protect everyone's interests. The meeting itself was tense but professional, held in a conference room that smelled of coffee and expensive furniture polish. Riverside Development sent 3 representatives, their general counsel, a senior vice president for development, and a community relations manager who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. They opened with an apology for the HOA board's behavior, which they characterized as an unfortunate example of volunteers overstepping their authority. Marcus noted that they carefully avoided admitting any corporate responsibility for the situation, positioning themselves as victims of bad actors, rather than as the entity that had created and enabled those actors. Rebecca cut through the pleasantries and laid out Marcus's position. The lease termination stood. The harassment had been real, well documented, and rose to the level that justified cancellation of the agreement. However, Marcus was willing to consider an alternative resolution that would accomplish his goals while minimizing harm to individual homeowners. He proposed that Riverside Development work with the Chen Family Trust to transfer ownership of the leased parcels directly to the homeowners living on them, at prices that reflected only the administrative costs rather than market value. This would give those families secure property rights while eliminating the trust's ongoing role as landowner. In exchange, Marcus wanted ironclad protections for his own property, including court-ordered permanent injunctions against any future HOA asserting authority over his land, and substantial financial compensation for the damages he'd suffered. The Riverside Development representatives asked for a recess to discuss the proposal privately. Marcus, Rebecca, and David waited in the conference room, drinking mediocre coffee and speculating about how long it would take the company to realize they were getting a better deal than they deserved. The recess lasted 90 minutes, which suggested serious internal debate, but when the Riverside team returned, they came back with an acceptance in principle. They'd agree to the land transfer framework, they'd pay damages, and they'd support the permanent injunctions. The details would take time to work out, but the outline of the deal was acceptable. The relief in the room was palpable, and Marcus felt tension he hadn't fully acknowledged begin to ease from his shoulders. This wasn't complete victory, and there would be months of work ahead to execute the agreement properly. But it was resolution without catastrophe, protection without cruelty, and an outcome that aligned with his principles without requiring him to hurt innocent people. The HOA that had tried to fine him $50,000 for growing tomatoes would cease to exist in any form that could threaten him. Sandra Whitmore and her board were already gone, and 240 families would end up owning their land outright, probably at prices far below market value, which would actually strengthen their long-term financial position. As Marcus left the meeting, walked out into afternoon sunshine that felt warmer and brighter than it had in weeks, he thought about his grandfather, Chen Wei, and the long game the old man had played. Marcus had inherited more than land. He'd inherited a strategic position built on foresight and careful planning, and he'd used that position to protect himself against exactly the kind of threat his grandfather had anticipated decades earlier. The lease arrangement had seemed almost paranoid when Marcus first learned about it, an excessive precaution against hypothetical future problems. But Chen Wei had understood something fundamental about property rights and power, that the person who owned the land ultimately controlled everything built on it, and that this basic fact could never be changed by contracts or covenants or HOA boards, no matter how official they made themselves seem. The HOA had learned that lesson the hard way, and Marcus suspected the story would become local legend, told and retold and probably exaggerated with each retelling. But he didn't care about the legend. He cared about going home to his property, replanting his garden, and living his life without fear of petty bureaucrats with delusions of authority. Everything else was just details that lawyers could handle.